Welcome everyone to the first of the parallel sessions for RIE 2022. This session is on new opportunities, which gathers three talks together. We've got one slightly longer talk to begin with, and then two slightly shorter lightning talks afterwards. So we'll have time for questions and answers as well. But I'm just going to quickly go on to the first talk because we have got a bit of limited time. So Tierney Kinnison is our first presenter today from Royal Veterinary College, and she will be talking about a quantitative exploration of blended and online students' experience and learning on a postgraduate certificate in veterinary education. So can I just turn to you?
So thanks so much for allowing me the opportunity to present on this first talk of the parallel sessions. It's really nice to be able to do that. I'm Tierney Kinnison from the RVC, as Matt has said, and presenting on behalf of a nice large project team, part of the Live Centre of the Royal Veterinary College. Iona is here with us, I believe, in the audience today, which is lovely as well. So our presentation is called, Is There a Difference in Student Engagement and Learning on the PG Cert Vet Ed when Comparing Blended and Online Only Delivery Modes? I realise I've changed that slightly from the one that was advertised. So as a little bit of outline, I'll give a bit of a background to who we are, our university, and then to our course, and a little bit of background just briefly on the literature that's led up to this as well. And then I'll present to you our research questions, methods and results, as well as an idea of some of the challenges about interpretation and dissemination, and some ideas for next steps of what would be really useful. So a little bit of background about the Royal Veterinary College. So we are quite obviously an institution that teaches veterinary students as one of our biggest groups of undergraduates, but we also have veterinary nursing students and BSc students, as well as a range of different postgrad students as well. This is our Hawkshead campus where we are based. We're up in Hertfordshire, but we also have a Camden campus because we're part of the University of London. So within this campus, one of those buildings is the LIVE building, the Lifelong Independent Veterinary Education Centre. And that is where Iona and I and our colleagues are based. And we run a suite of veterinary education courses. So we have a postgraduate certificate in veterinary education, the PG Cert, which is what this presentation is about, as well as a diploma and also a master's in the same topic of veterinary education. So our PG Cert Vet Ed supports understanding of pedagogy and development of teaching practice of various different professionals. So either those that teach veterinary students or paraveterinary students as well. So again, thinking about veterinary nurses, farriers and so on. So our students are really advanced education sort of practitioners maybe, and they could be within a university setting, or they could be out within practice where veterinary students, for example, might go and see them. So they're really busy professional people who are doing an additional course in this PG Cert Vet Ed. Our course was established back in 2010, so it's really well established at the RVC, and it has been accredited by Advanced HE or Higher Education Academy from the beginning. So when our students graduate, they can choose to also become a fellow, usually of the Higher Education Academy. So the PG Cert Vet Ed is over a course of 1 year, usually, and it's split into 10 units within 2 different modules, which we call 5 and A-Scive, or Foundations in Veterinary Education and Applied Concepts in Veterinary Education. And what we have done since 2010 is have 2 very different cohorts of students going through this exact same course. So we traditionally had a completely face-to-face group, so they would come to us for a face-to-face synchronous workshop. And in 2019, we changed it a little bit to be a bit more blended. So obviously, as we've heard today, blended can mean all sorts of different things. So I want to give you quite a specific definition of what we mean in terms of the synchronicity and the different modalities and so on. So for our blended learners, the online material for each of the 10 units is introduced at the very beginning of that 1 month. And this might be some short text to read, or maybe an article or a video to watch. And then they also have to do some individual activities. So this is where I hope it really does that active blended learning. It's not just read something and forget about it. We want them to really go and do an activity and then bring this new thinking in with them to the face-to-face workshop. And this workshop is a whole day workshop, and it's at the midpoint, so 2 weeks into that 1 month. And then by the end of the month, so another 2 weeks later, they're asked to produce a really short summative assessment, which is a reflective piece on their learning throughout the unit. And they're also required to provide some peer feedback to another peer on this, on their assessment as well. So that's how our blended learners look. And our distance learners are similar but different. So they also have the online material released at the start, which has got text and articles and videos, but they have asynchronous discussion boards, which they are suggested to take part in throughout the whole course of that 1 month time. They also have a synchronous session. It's a 1 hour, what we call a Q&A session at that mid-unit point, so about 2 weeks within. And they do the exact same end of unit summative assessment as the blended learners. So thinking about assessments, as we have done a lot so far today, there are 3 sort of main types that our students go through on the PG Cert Vet Ed. So there's these end of unit summative assessments. So there's all of them that they have to complete, as well as the peer feedback, and they get percentages for doing that. There's also, they're required to undertake a teaching observation and write a reflective essay about their learning based on that teaching observation within the first module 5. And then in the second module, A5, they're required to create a teaching presentation. So they create a whole new teaching idea and they give us a presentation about it, and that's marked as well. And finally, they do 2 big summative essays, one at the end of 5 and one at the end of A5. So the points I want you to kind of remember from this slide about assessments is that they do a reflective essay as part of 5 based on a teaching observation, as well as 1 based on the whole of the that module. So if we look a little bit to the literature about distance learning and face-to-face learning, obviously you guys may well be more experts in this literature than I will be, but it's been suggested for quite a long time that it's a good idea to investigate the effectiveness of distance learning courses and, where possible, compare them to traditional face-to-face type methods or blended kind of methods. And I've just picked out a couple of meta-analyses that I came across from the last sort of range of years, one which showed that online learning students did perform modestly better, and one that showed that there wasn't a significant difference between synchronous distance education and traditional education. So I think achievement can be quite complex in terms of trying to compare these 2 sort of groups. We can also bring in the idea of engagement. Engagement is a really quite a complex topic, but if we use Frederick's framework, then we can consider that there's 3 different parts: behavioural, cognitive and emotional or affective, which are distinct but also interlinked. And this presentation just focuses on the behavioural element of engagement, and that's those observable behaviours that demonstrate engagement. And it has been suggested that those demonstrable behavioural engagements are linked to achievement. So when we start to bring these together, these couple of examples are all actually happen to be from anatomy, but it suggests that student learning outcomes in a blended learning course in this example were predicted by the level of behavioural engagement with the online content, and they use this as viewing pages and also viewing discussion boards. But they also, these same authors, had a different paper where they looked at the actual activity within the discussion boards. And again, they suggested that discussion board participation was linked to achievement. However, other articles where you start to think about the modality as well suggested that the mode of delivery had no difference on the achievement, but the different type of engagement did have was a determinant of performance. So we get to our research aim and our specific opportunity. So we wanted to explore the differences and similarities between the 2 learning modes that we have in order to really develop the course using possible best practices from both. We think we had a relatively rare opportunity to study 2 completely separate modes of learning, but for one exact same course that was delivered at the exact same time to these students. So our research question really was, is there a difference in student engagement and achievement on a PG Cert Vet Ed when comparing blended and online only delivery modes? So obviously we gained ethics approval from our university, and this was a retrospective cohort study. So we looked back on data that we already had from activity logs from their online activities, as well as obviously assessment scores. And there were various challenges with the whole of this project. So if you look at the year that this was conducted, which was at the end of 2019, you can all kind of anticipate what I'm going to say, is that halfway through their PG Serv Ed, the pandemic hit, and rather than having the two different cohorts, all of our blended learning students became distance learning students. So we were unable to do any kind of comparisons for the A5 module. And so this limited our analysis to the 5 module only. I said earlier there's 10 units within 5, but actually the 5th unit is a kind of a summary unit, so that wasn't really able to be analysed either. And for our face-to-face learners, our blended learners, the very first module is not that flipped element that we were trying to bring in, that active learning before they came to the workshop. So again, that one couldn't specifically be analysed. So already we're down to just looking at 3 or 4 units, unfortunately. We also started out with 72 students, but we're only able to analyse 55. This is if students were only undertaking part of a course or withdrew, that kind of thing. But very handily, this gave us 27 blended and 28 online learning students. So we had to decide how we were going to define our achievement and our engagement. And for us, we looked at achievement as an average score of the 2 marked assessments. So I said at the beginning, there was a reflective essay based on a teaching observation and a reflective essay based on that whole 5 module. And it was these 2 reflective essays that were graded and then averaged to give the student an achievement score. When we looked at engagement, we gave the blended learners, we looked at their workshop attendance, so how many they literally came to. And we also gave them a blended engagement score, which was how many pages they had viewed online prior to then attending the workshop. So this is had they done the pre-activities or had they at least looked. For our online learners, we were able to look at the level of participation in the online discussion forums, and this was their online engagement score. So to go into those 2 things a little bit more deeply, for our blended students, depending on how many percentage of pages viewed per unit, they then got a score between 0 to 5, and then they got an average score over the course of the 3 units if they attended all 3. For our online students, we created what we think is really quite a nice grid of sort of participation in discussion forums. So this went from scoring 0 if they did absolutely nothing, they didn't actually access that discussion forum, to if they looked at it, they scored a 1. If they looked and then returned again, they scored 2. If they posted on the forum, they scored a 3. If they posted and then came back after a certain amount of time, then they scored a 4. And if they posted and then came back after a certain amount of time and posted again, they scored a 5. And we think this was really an indication of if they were being more deeply engaged with the material and potentially gave them an opportunity to really socially learn with other students. So if we move on to start to look at our results. So for the blended learners, what we found was that students attended either 2 or 3 of the 3 face-to-face workshops, and the median was 3. Our average online engagement scores ranged from 0 to 5, which was the complete the range that could have been, but the median here was 5. So these overarching results really indicate that we had really good attendance at the workshops and really nice engagement with the online material, in so much as we know that most of them looked at between 80 to 100% of the pages. Obviously, we don't know what they did with that information, but they did at least access the pages. When we started to do our Spearman's row correlations, we found that there was no significant correlation between attendance at the workshops and attainment in those 2 essays. And we also found that there was no significant correlation between engagement in terms of those pages viewed before the workshop and attainment. And that's the graph that I've got just there. So as you can see, the engagement scores were quite clumped within the 5, but do range, and the assessment averages are around sort of 50 odd to 70 odd. If I move on at speed to look at our online learners, their engagement scores range from 0 to 4. Again, the possibility was 0 to 5. So that means none of them scored that 5. And the median was 1. So this is looking but not contributing. So this is what we could have termed way back when maybe as lurkers. So most of the students are looking at each of the discussion boards, but they're not actually contributing to them in terms of writing something down. So it's maybe a little bit disappointing that we didn't get any students who was posting and revisiting and looking again and posting and actually forming a conversation. Instead, they were looking at what other students have already done and then not even returning to see it updated. We also noted that engagement scores decreased as the module progressed, and these are total engagement for the whole of the unit, so more than just 0 to 5. So for Unit 1, we had a score of 65 going down to 52, 41 and 36 for Unit 4. So again, there could be very many different reasons for this. It could be that they're more focused on the summative exams and less likely to be posting and looking at discussion forums come Unit 4. Potentially it may be that they had different interests in different units or different interests in the PG Cert as it progressed. And again, there was no significant correlation between engagement and attainment. So again, you can see here the engagement scores were more spread for our distance learners between 0 and 4, but the assessment average wasn't linked to that. So if we have a go at comparing the cohorts, it's quite difficult in this example to compare engagement directly. Obviously, the constructs of engagement that we used were not the same between the two cohorts. What we can say is that the blended learning students we thought had quite good engagement, and the distance learning students had potentially quite disappointing engagement in terms of what we might expect or desire from a discussion forum. And what we also found when we looked at achievement was that our blended learning students scored significantly higher scores on those exams than the distance learning students. So the blended learning scored 60.6 and the distance learning 56.1. Now, although this is a significant difference and actually gives us a lot that we need to then think about, in reality, the sort of real world impact of this, both the scores of 60 and 56 were sort of a mid-range pass. So there's not a sort of a huge difference in real world implications, but there was a significant difference between our two groups of students. So potentially that good engagement by our blended learning students has a difference. Potentially how they're able to learn socially within the one-day workshop might have a difference. So I do want to spend a little bit of time also thinking about the challenges that we had to interpreting and generalising this data, because the project wasn't a terribly easy one for various reasons. So unfortunately, we ended up with a little bit of lack of data compared to what we wanted. As I've already mentioned, COVID hit, so we weren't able to use the ASIVE module, and we lost some of our students if they weren't completing all of the assessments, for example. We also only did this over the course of 1 year, would have potentially maybe liked to have done it more as well later on. We also had various aspects of similarities in scores. So as I said, the blended students, a lot of them scored 5 on engagement, and that kind of ceiling effect, I think, maybe limits the ability for stats to sort of detect difference. So altogether, we may have a low power, which suggests that even if there was a difference between engagement and achievement, perhaps in this data at this time point, we couldn't actually identify that difference. And that's potentially supported by the fact that if I show you the students that failed those 2 essays, especially if we look at the distance learners, the 3 fails for them were very much within the 0 to 1 engagement score. So it could be that those students didn't use the discussion forums and perhaps should have done and could have benefited, whereas those students scoring between 0 and 1 who still got in the 70s and 80s sort of level, perhaps they're really aware of what learning works best for them, and they're able to adapt and don't necessarily need to post on discussion forums. We do also have a certain amount of complexity regarding our participants. So it's not simply just a case of students being blended or distance. And I think that's what we're realising more and more. Our blended learning cohort are mostly RBC staff. They are put on this course and required to do it and complete it as a new lecturer. So they may have different kind of motivations or drive to do the course than potentially distance learning students, although they are potentially paying for it themselves. And you may have additional motivation as well. The types of students we have quite similar. They're both high academics and all sorts of different professions on both. So that might not make a difference as much. There's also complexity around the ideas of engagement and attainment. So we use a very sort of simplistic measure of engagement, whether they looked at a page, whether they came to a workshop. This obviously is just a measure and doesn't look into it more qualitatively. And with attainment, ideally, we'd really have liked to look at how they made the real world impact. So we could have looked at, or we wanted to look at their essays and see if they had a real world change based on their learning, but unfortunately we were not yet able to do that. So my last sort of point here is the next steps that we want to go on to. So interestingly, we have made the decision to change our course completely to all distance learning. So we have lost our blended learning students and they have all become distance learning students as of after the pandemic. So this obviously gives us lots of opportunities, but it also means we do want to learn from that fact that our blended students did score better than our distance learning students. And one thing I think we really have learned about is more the idea that really synchronous sessions that enable a community of practice to be built is really, really important. So we used to have just that one Q&A session halfway through the module for each of the distance learning students, and we now have about 3 of them that each have a different function. In addition, we have really voluntary sort of social sessions online that the students can come to sort of try and build that community as well. And importantly, as I said, this is quite a quantitative, simplistic view of engagement and achievement. And my colleagues at the bottom here, who I've included because they're making these changes within the course and doing this research, are really looking at a qualitative evaluation of the learner's experience of online learning. So first off, they're looking at the same cohort that I looked at the time point when the blended students went distance. So they're exploring that experience. But then hopefully more recently as well, we'll explore the experience of students on this new course where we have utilised what we've learned about our blended learning into our completely distance learning course. So I wanted to highlight these 4 colleagues in the ongoing work that they're doing just now. So these are the references we used back at the start for the literature basis, and hopefully that is around about 20 minutes. And I want to thank massively our PG Cert vetted students who obviously allowed us to use this data and who are wonderful students and work with us really brilliantly. And my colleagues on this specific project as well as those within the live team that are developing our courses, and our funders who are CDE or now Code. And also to you all here for listening to me just today. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Tierney. If anyone would like to ask a question, we've got about sort of 5 minutes before we move to the next talks, and we'll have some time at the end as well for Q&A with everyone. So is anyone that would like to either raise a hand or put something in the chat? Either way would be good. While that's potentially going on, oh, Cassandra, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, just because, well, thank you very much. It's a lovely presentation, and well, you'll see our blended learning and all of that, and how we engage with the students is something that I'm going to hopefully, talk a little bit about. I was just curious, when you said that it's staff that are doing the PG Cert, when they start, those on the blending course, did they know each other beforehand? Were they familiar with each other beforehand?
That's a really great question, and a real mix. So we have, the RVC is a very small university compared to lots of universities, but it's very sort of separate and not necessarily everybody knows everybody. So no, I would say, so I did the course myself before now teaching on it, which was a lovely thing to have experienced. And I can certainly say when I did the course, I knew very few people within it. And there's a good we get a really good number of our blended students, and now obviously our whole distance learning. So they're very unlikely to know all of them, but they are likely to know a couple of people maybe quite well.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking about that in terms of community practice.
Yes.
How much familiarity gets.
It's a good question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'll just quickly go to Leonard, who's put something in the chat. Did you have any difficulty getting your study approved? He's curious because he's interested in doing something similar himself.
I don't think we did. We were lucky to get the funding from CDE, and then we have a really fantastic ethics board here, our social science and ethical review board at the RVC. They're very good at understanding all sorts of different research. So I don't think we did have any trouble ethics-wise speaking here, actually. Yeah, if you've got any sort of specific questions, maybe you can feel free to drop me a line afterwards, and I can certainly help with any questions that you might have that might be specific.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We're going to move on in a second, but I'll just quickly ask a question. how did you try to assure some kind of similarity between the blended and the distance students, so that it's not necessarily equal across the board in the sense of sort of they're doing exactly the same things, but you're trying to get a sort of similar level of kind of learning opportunity? Did you sort of think and talk about that at all, or was that because of something that kind of sort of happened?
A bit of both. We did talk about it extensively, but we were always a little bit conscious of the fact that actually, they do get a different experience, no matter what you do, being in a 4-day workshop. And some people loved the 4-day workshop and some people hated the 4-day workshops. And much the same, I'm sure, as the 1-hour Q&A sessions. Some people came, and we were talking, one of the talks earlier was really interesting for us because, or for me, I thought, those people that can't attend that, they're watching the recording, but how useful is that? Is it serving that dual purpose? And it's certainly not necessarily doing the same as a workshop would have been doing. So we tried very hard, and we more and more recently up to this, we were really giving the distance learners real focused activities that were actually very similar to the workshop activities, but they were then asked obviously to do it on a discussion forum. But we were always conscious of the fact that that's a massive challenge. And in some ways, I think we do feel more comfortable now that it is one course delivered the same, and there isn't just a natural equality to everyone. But based on that, because we've lost the workshops that we think had a certain element of goodness about them, we want to not lose what we had, and are very much working hard to utilise that information.
Yeah, so sort of learning from sort of kind of what worked well there,
yes.
Trying to bring a different place entirely. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. We'll probably come back. We'll come back to you sort of at the end of the session with some more Q&A. Sure. But we'll move on to Cassandra next. So Cassandra Lewis is from QMUL. She's going to be talking on online learning design for preclinical courses. So over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to do a quick whistle-stop tour, lightning talk about online learning design for preclinical courses. So as I said, my name is Cassie Lewis. I'm a clinical lecturer in paediatric dentistry at Queen Mary University. And the module that I'm going to be talking about is a 12-week online e-learning module in paediatric dentistry. So that's a 3rd-year undergraduate dental students. And it's part of what prepares them sort of from that transition from theory to practice. So like all the talks today, I'm sure COVID-19 had a huge impact on the way we delivered our curriculum. We, overnight almost had to design engaging and interactive and authentic teaching and learning activities for the students. And for us in dentistry, obviously, there's a huge amount of practical component in that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the module and then explore the student and staff perspectives, and again, what the future preclinical education might look like. So online blended learning design is a huge topic in of itself. So this is just to quickly mention the co-design S framework, which I used for this module. It came initially out of the University of Liverpool and Imperial College London, but it's really, really great for helping you, for introducing and applying pedagogy, and then also structuring your online modules. And that's sort of what we did, because it helps you stage each part of your module or components of your module so that you have a combination of the solo activities, group work as well, you're getting reflection in there. It also helps to guide educators on time allocation for different components and with mapping your learning outcomes. It also helps you as well for getting recognition, you can see here, for mapping to professional development for HEA fellowship and so on. So this is the system that we used in this online pediatric module, used a blended learning format where we started with essential reading of guidelines, followed by online quizzes where students were then applying the guidelines to clinical photos. We then had a group work to try to get reflection, and we had group reflection forums, online small group seminars with a case-based discussion. We had a case of a little girl called Maria that runs through the whole thing. And then lastly, a poster presentation where, again, they get together in their groups, and that was all done online. And now looking a little bit about student feedback, this is over the last 3 years that we've been running it. It has changed a little bit over the years, but you can see we've still got really good feedback for usefulness to learning. This is student self-perceptions of usefulness to learning. So online quizzes and clinical case scenarios when they're doing the case-based discussions continues to score very highly. I think progressively we can see here students liking less and less to read large amounts of text in terms of guidelines. And we particularly struggled with getting reflection embedded in this module. I think it probably shows, I guess, the opinions of students in terms of how much they value peers' opinions on application of knowledge compared to the opinions of their tutors, who perhaps they still feel they need a lot of guidance from. The poster presentation got introduced later down the line and has increased in usefulness as it's become part of a formative assessment. But the bit that I was most concerned about was that students initially would have come on to clinic a lot more. This was a totally online option, but confidence, you can see on the right-hand side there, was still improved with them coming on to seeing real patients. And similarly here, but over the last 2 years, we have students thinking that online learning is better or equally as good as face-to-face teaching, which is reassuring for us going forward. So what works for students? We know that they need structure. We know they also want flexibility in their online learning. It has to feel relevant to them. And I think, again, you think about individualized learning needs, need to embed interactive media, varied and inclusive formats for all the different learning needs, but also combinations of individual and group work activities. And we're just hearing a little bit about communities of practice and building those relationships. I'm sure I'm not alone though, although I think maybe this is different with undergrad students. We have struggled increasingly with poor engagement and poor attendance, and also a little bit about the social development with these students earlier on. If they haven't met one another, are they, do they have sense of belonging? Are they developing those friendships? And even from a sort of a clinical standpoint, the development of team working skills, professionalism, communication, and things like that. For staff, we all have the opportunity to develop new skills. We can evaluate our practice online, probably in a completely different way to what we were doing online. A lot of the software now allows us to monitor student progress, and we can target interventions if we see that a student isn't engaging or hasn't participated as much. And if you do use a lot of these sort of reusable sort of sections of our module, you can reuse them. So it's not lost time. You can flip them and use them again the following year. But in order to do that, obviously, you have to be familiar with tech. Digital literacy is a real problem for us. It was a real uphill struggle when we first started, because it does take a lot of time as well. You're thinking as well about continuity or contingency planning, because if someone leaves, who's going to follow that up? Because it's not the same as just having a set of lectures. And for us as staff, I can certainly say, even from my personal feeling, I used to know students all by name when everything was face-to-face. So I think things are changing now, where we've got to be sure that we still have that familiarity with identifying students. So going forward for us, I think it's really important that we find that balance of the blend in terms of what can be done face-to-face, what needs to be done online, because online is just so valuable. And as we were saying, students, some people absolutely love online, some people love face-to-face. So being able to offer both of those. So that's where listening to student expectations, qualitative research, again, on what their expectations and experiences of online education have been, working with students to establish what their responsibilities are. I know for undergrads, I think, you're looking at things like learning contracts and things like that for their self-directed learning to ensure that they understand the importance of engaging. And also looking at attendance. Should we be looking at attendance? Because based on that, are we thinking, attendance doesn't always equate to learning. And for dentistry, we've got new things like haptics, virtual reality. We've also got all other kind of integrated portfolios that we can do, and phantom head teaching, where we're doing a lot of flipped learning, which I think now is just embedded online practice. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And this is a list of the references. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Cassandra. I think we've got a bit of time that we can ask a question or two, and Iona has just put a quick one in there. So in your module, are there any formative assessment points? Was the question.
So yes, we had continuous formative assessments where that they had to do two things. They all had to complete the quiz and pass it at 70%. So again, it wasn't counting towards the summative assessment. They could do it as many times as they like. And over the course of years, additional feedback was put in. Till now, I don't even get emails from students. I think there's enough it's sort of self-contained. So that was one. The second formative thing is they were obliged to engage with the online reflection forum. So everyone had to post once. I got a lot of resistance when I asked students to not only post, but also then comment on somebody else's post. I think a lot of them felt uncomfortable with that. But that was another activity. And then the final one, the poster presentation, that as well is formative. because it gears them towards a summative assessment that they do where they have to do an unseen case, which is sort of like based on a clinical picture and looks a little bit like a poster. So the whole thing actually was formative.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. I think you both yourself and Tierney both mentioned the discussion forum and how you kind of struggled to get engagement with that. So I think that's something maybe we'll talk at the end with when everyone's finished. But I think that's a crucial point that's kind of coming up twice here. But we've got one question here from Leonard, so I'll just present that and then we'll move on to the next talk. How did it work with the presentations? Did they present just once?
Yeah, they presented just once, and it was all done online. And the first time we did it, they presented to each other, but they found that a little bit boring because they were doing it on the same case. So that's something where perhaps we do different cases. But it was just the once. I think going forward, a lot of the feedback has been that they want to see each other. So there's the potential. My hope is to bring that part back into the classroom so that they'll get to and maybe have different cases they can present. That's my plan.
Yeah, it's getting that kind of social element going again, isn't it, really? And yeah, making that a special occasion almost as well. So it's also something to look forward to in their cases. Maybe not, depending on what they think of it. But yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Okay, I will ask this question as it relates. So who did they present to, their peers or wider audience?
They presented to peers and to myself and one other staff member, because we teach across 2 different cohorts of students. It's myself and the lead for the other. So we do hygiene therapy as well as dentistry. So it was to us as well as their group.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, on to our last talk for this session. So thank you very much for that, Cassandra. And that's Aondover, who will be talking about contemporary computation teaching in communication scholarship. So if I can hand over to you.
I'm Aondover Msughter from Skyline University, Nigeria. And I will be talking about a contemporary computation teaching method in communication scholarship. And the idea behind the paper is, especially in developing countries, now you can discover that we are moving towards the technological era where everything has been digitalized, and the kind of quality of education we give to our students, especially in communication and scholarship, is quite not yet different. We still use the same old method in teaching, and considering the fact that communication is a practical-based and course or profession that warrant journalists to engage into the practical aspect, they need to be up to date in terms of applying this new method so that they can be able to function effectively when they leave school. So in Nigeria, for example, we have just migrated, most of the broadcasting industry have migrated from analog to digital, but the quality of teaching in the classroom is not yet changed. Most of the teachers use all these old methods in impacting knowledge, which has a kind of deficiency on the students. So by way of introduction, because of this, we are in a digital era where everything has been digitalized. There is a need or quest for us to adopt these modern technological tools in teaching. And based on this, the study intends to explore how we can adopt new pedagogical teaching method in communication scholarship, and also to find out how technology can be used in order to assist students in adopting this method, and to also examine some of these new methods in teaching. So the paper basically is a conceptual paper, and it is anchored on the theoretical framework of technological determinism theory, which was developed by Marshall McLuhan in 1964. And the postulation of the theory is that technology is the drive, especially in academic, because day in, day out, new methods are coming out, and we have to adopt these methods in impacting knowledge. And the student have to be up to date, especially in this technological era, for them to be able to equip themselves with this method of learning. So research method, the paper is a conceptual paper, and all the arguments are rooted within the existing literature to see how we can be able to advance such an argument in using this new method. So the paper checks some of the consistency in the existing literature and how such a literature can be interrogated and add value to the current paper. Now, new pedagogical methods were suggested, and number one was the flip teaching method. And this, in this new era of technology, flip teaching method is a kind of maybe a method where students are often engaged themselves, where the teacher or the instructor give them some maybe take home assignment where they research on their own without the teacher's interference, and then they come, interact, discuss such issues. And the second method is the inquiry or the discovery method, where students are allowed to use this technology that are available within their domain to see how they can discover new things and then improve their own knowledge based on their curiosity in learning, so that they can be able to advance their new skills. Now, the third one was the situation-based learning method, where a particular situation would be identified by the instructor, and then everything would be dumped in the hands of the student to research and then discover new ways on that particular subject matter. Now, the problem-based learning method was also suggested in the paper, whereby a particular problem would be identified, and based on the availability of some of the technological innovation, students can be able to use that knowledge and then address that particular problem. Then the computer-assisted instruction, which is also known as CAI, was also proposed in the paper, where students will be able to use computer in solving problem, or even at home, they can be able to use this computer for knowledge base, where they can, on their own, research on issue, and then they can be able to find out quite relevant information as far as the issue is concerned. Then the brainstorming method was also suggested in the paper, where students can use this computer and then reflect on such issue again and again, and they can be able to come up with fantastic solution at the end. So basically, this teaching method that the paper adapted are validated with the existing literature. Most of the existing literature in the area also support that new technological method need to strengthen the theoretical postulation, and students should also engage in this teaching and learning process using the available technology, so that they can be able to advance their skills. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, thank you for that. If anyone would like to ask a question, please do put in the chat or raise your hand, and we can ask those. In the meantime, can I just quickly ask you how you think, how did the students actually respond to this? Did they manage to keep up with the technology themselves, and did they sort of engage with kind of flipped teaching methods?
So basically, most of these students, when they engage themselves in maybe the practical aspect of journalism, the kind of quality and education they give them is far from the kind of things they meet in the industry themselves. So I propose this because we need, even the instructor themselves need to adopt this new technological innovation for them to impact knowledge to them, so that they can be able to know what it implies and how they can be able to manipulate this teaching method or this new method in the practical aspect of journalism.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, I've always found it kind of a challenge to make sure that sort of students are all on the same page when it comes to the digital tools. So it's sort of quite interesting to sort of see sort of how they respond. But it's very much a life skill that they need to learn if they're not already knowledgeable, definitely. So yeah, can we open up the questions to everyone and see what comes out? So yeah, as I say, if you could put something in the chat or raise your hand, please do so. I want to pick up on that, on the kind of topic of forums, and kind of link it to what you were sort of saying there as well, Anne-Marie, sort of because this sort of digital tool that we choose or use makes quite a big difference and can do. And I know on courses that I've taught on, especially recently, the forum just doesn't seem to be working at all anymore. It did for a long time, and it seems to be failing now. So I just want to sort of ask, in a way, sort of, where do you see things going from here in terms of not just the discussion forum, but sort of changing the tools that we use in response to how students engage with them?
Shall I come in? Can I come in
first?
So I'm not involved so much in running our PG set at the moment as of now, but the team that I presented the pictures of are wonderful, and some of the stuff they're doing is reducing some of the discussion forums. So I think there's definitely a use for discussion forums. They certainly have their place, and for asynchronous type students that need that flexibility in time, you know, sometimes that is a great way to use them. But a couple of things that our group have done is to build in, to remove a certain discussion forum and replace it with a sort of a pairs activity. So they are given a timeline when they have to complete this activity by, which makes it more synchronous. So they can do it in their own time. It doesn't have to be done on one day, but it has to be done by a certain date. And that actually gives them the chance to have a conversation between each other. Like they have to record a conversation about a paper they've read or something. And then we watch that back rather than reading endless or not reading any posts on discussion forums. And I think, you know, one of the data points that we had about our students, they might, even if they do post on a discussion forum and we're like, yay, they've posted, we can reply. Do they ever go back and revisit and have that conversation? I don't necessarily think they do. Whereas this where we're forcing them almost to have that conversation, and then maybe they can watch someone else's video, and then they get really more chatty to each other on these posts, and that's really nice. The challenge is that because our students are so, you know, like they're off doing their own full-time jobs as well as this, is that we're putting an additional time limit on that unit, and that's really hard for them. So we get the feedback of, we love it, but it's really hard. We love it, but it's really time consuming and challenging. So, but those, I think those kind of more, like students are more used to doing Zoom calls with each other now. So I think formulating it and using that interaction rather than a typey has worked for us. Or we don't know, we're going to research it, but it seems to be working for us.
Yeah, I think definitely sort of, yeah, the kind of sort of, there is a change in how students are familiar with Zoom and actually kind of engage in that in a different way. So maybe that is part of the issue as well, is that they don't want to type anymore. They want to actually express in different ways, and that sometimes it's a way of sort of trying to engage with that. Cassandra, yeah, would you like to come in?
Sure. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head with trying to get them more engaged and interactive like that, because we went down a different path where what we did was, over the last 2 years, I made like an ebook of all student reflections. So what I had was, because I thought it was, because we had a huge year, there wasn't enough time to interact with every single post. So I thought if I have a collection, then students can sort of see where they fit in the group. And that was like, yeah, that's nice, that's useful. But I read it for like the first, 4 weeks, but I didn't keep going at it for the last 12. Another suggestion was whether or not you make the reflections part of like a portfolio as you go through. So that becomes marked at the end, which is again another way where but then you end up just assessing everything, don't you, all the time. So I think we've decided that mostly the most important bit is just going to have it as part of the dialogue in our case-based discussions. That also then has the chance that students sometimes sit a bit quiet when you do ask those questions. So it swings and roundabouts really. So I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I know how to nail that yet and get students reflecting and discussing with each other. So I think that is certainly something that we need to all try and crack, I think.
Yeah, I think we're all in the same boat in that regard a little bit. Adnan, would you like to come in as well?
Thank you very much. I think this is a wonderful interaction. I've learned a lot from the presentation, particularly the second presenter. And I think she mentioned something that digital literacy in her presentation, and I keep wondering, and I was trying to balance the argument with the digital dichotomy theory, which argue side by side. Most of the students don't even have what it takes. We do not have the digital ability to maybe engage in reading or researching or conducting research on their own. So I keep wondering, so if there is this digital divide, and then it becomes challenging for us. So I propose that maybe we should also do more studies to see how we can be able to bridge this gap in terms of the digital dichotomy theory as postulated. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go on, Cassandra.
Oh, no, I was just going to say we had it at the start with some staff members not having, not really knowing how to use Teams. None of us knew how to use Zoom. A lot of students were doing everything off their phone, which meant then they couldn't access half the things that we were putting on. Then loads of content went on our virtual learning environment, and that got really, really slow. So yeah, it's that whole, I think a lot of research around how we bridge those gaps is, and everything's going to be changing with that as we go, I think.
Yeah, and there's no way to sort of just assume digital knowledge, is there? Sort of, there could be somebody that's quite young that you'd expect to have certain digital knowledge that they don't, and somebody that's older that actually has much more than your stereotypes would expect. And so we've got to really sort of consider all options. I mean, Iona sort of put on here, what about sort of other kind of tools like sort of WhatsApp or things that more people are familiar with, and using those kind of tools to do that instead. Do any of you have a sort of thought on that? How that could that kind of thing help? Not necessarily WhatsApp itself, but could be sort of Facebook or Twitter or other kind of tools that are a bit more common in ordinary daily life, I suppose.
I think it probably could. From my perspective, I guess it becomes a little bit difficult if you're using clinical photos and pictures like that. I mean, it's all confidential because it's photos of people's mouths or teeth or whatnot. But the only thing I would say when you go more onto the social media side of it is whether or not the dynamics of the groups work, because I think that's been something that has happened. I've noticed with some of our students that when we have taken things inverted commas outside the classroom, even if it be a digital classroom, you don't always know how well they get on, or there's the whole cyberbullying side of things that I think you might need to be careful of. And again, no stereotyping of ages and all the rest. I think that would be my only concern a little bit, where it's sort of like, where does the professionalism stop there with the social media side? I have no experience in it, though, I'll be honest.
Yeah, and I mean, another difficulty is the tracking of kind of sort of, you sort of mentioned sort of we're getting quite good at now being able to sort of see where there are issues and how things are going. But when you move to something else, a kind of another tool, then actually you potentially lose that all again. And how do you sort of kind of make that work again? Okay. I mean, on this sort of digital divide question, I suppose the other kind of thing here is sort of what next? Where do we take these kind of challenges? I mean, there's sort of still blended kind of questions here. This sort of going completely distance as well. And obviously we don't know sort of if the pandemic will cause reversals and all sorts in the future, but where do you see this going in your context? Tierney, would you like to start, and we'll move through in order?
Yeah, I mean, so as I say, I think we're really quite comfortable and happy with our decision to go completely distance. We, my team, again, it's not me, is very, Iona being primarily one of them, is a real innovator in distance learning and has a wealth of knowledge already. And the new developments that everyone else is thinking about and publishing nowadays are only helping more and more. So I think we are personally really very happy with this, and all of our aspects of teaching, doing teaching observations online. That's something that Iona was developing many years ago, and these kind of things. These are things that we're now thankfully quite comfortable with. But we're in a vet college where we have vet students needing to be doing stuff in classrooms quite often as well. So we are this small cohort who have these veterinary educators, and we can really sort of do this online very well, but we certainly appreciate the challenges of other courses.
Okay, thank you. Cassandra.
I think for us, for me, I'm sort of going the opposite way. I'm going to try and bring something back into the classroom, but more just because I feel like although students like the online learning, they want the social. So it's more, I would say, I think it's more to get that get the familiarity in. So I think the blend will still be there, because similarly, I suppose, to veterinary, you're going to have at some point, if you're doing practical skills classes, students do come in. So it's not like a course that would be, at some point, I guess they'll all get to meet each other. So I think in terms of where we go, it's just about finding that balance. And I'd be kind of interested to know at what stage in an academic career of a student, because that will probably change. Someone who's just starting off, who doesn't know anyone, might want more face-to-face than someone who's got an established friendship group in their later years and wants to just do the online stuff and pass their exams because they're not meeting people anymore. So I don't know, this is hypothesis, but I don't know if that would make a difference as well. Maybe not one size fits all as always, but yeah.
Yeah, that's quite crucial, isn't it? I think. Aondover.
You see, to me, actually, I'm thinking because of this new media, with a new media era, and even the teaching method has to be changed. Because although, like me, what I personally normally do is I just discover that most of my students, in fact, they're almost online. In fact, they have taken online things seriously, and I try in as much as possible to be visible so that most of the times I can be there to monitor what they do and know that sometimes, in fact, they're not even using the social media positively based. Sometimes you see some of them even spending quality time on this social media, but it's not even for academic purpose, maybe for other issues and all that. So I think as instructors or as teachers, we should be able to see how we can be able to curtail and see how they can be able to use this social media positively for the promotion of an academic rather than maybe using them for other stuff. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, all three of us speakers. We've actually, I'm afraid, run out of time on this parallel session. So thank you very much for that really stimulating discussion. Really, it was sort of really interesting to see sort of what kind of things you're all doing and what kind of shared challenges we all have in this day and age.